The late afternoon sun painted the Texas prairie in shades of amber and gold. Garrett Blake sat in his weathered rocking chair on the front porch watching the land he'd built stretch endlessly toward the horizon. At 65, his hair had gone silver, his face lined with the kind of deep creases that came from 30 years of squinting into the sun, but his gray eyes remained sharp as winter steel. Beside him, his grandson, Thomas Reed Blake, stood with the restless energy of 18 years' hands shoved deep in his pockets. The boy was leaving in 3 days for a war they were calling the Great War, though Garrett suspected there would be nothing great about it. Just blood and mud, and boys coming home with holes in their souls that no amount of time could fill. In the garden behind the house, Sarah moved among the vegetable rows with the same quiet grace she'd brought to this place 30 years ago. Her hair had gone silver too, though her hands remained steady as they tended the tomato plants. Further out near the main barn, Emma Reed directed ranch operations with the kind of natural authority that made grown men twice her age listen without question. At 37, she'd become everything Garrett had seen in that sharp-eyed 7-year-old girl the first day she stepped down from that mud-caked stagecoach. And somewhere in town, Lily Hartwell Cooper was teaching a classroom full of children their letters, her gentle patience a gift passed down from the woman who'd raised her when the world had tried to tear them apart. Thomas broke the comfortable silence. "Grandpa, tell me again why you named me after great-grandfather Thomas if you never even met him." Garrett's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Because some men leave legacies they never intended. Your great-grandfather gave me the greatest gift of my life, even though he died before I could thank him." "What gift?" Garrett gestured toward Sarah in the garden, then toward Emma, coordinating with the ranch hands. "Your grandmother and those 2 little girls who changed everything. Without him, without the choices he made, even the mistakes, none of this would exist. Not this ranch the way it is now, not this family, not you." Thomas absorbed this the way young men do when they're trying to understand the weight of history before they carry their own into battle. "Tell me the story again, the real story, about how they came here." "Which part?" Garrett asked. "The stagecoach. The fight with your great-great-aunt Catherine, the courtroom. All of it, from the beginning." Garrett settled deeper into his chair, his gaze drifting across the years. It was spring of 1881, storm clouds building like they are now. I was waiting for a housekeeper, one single woman to cook and clean. What stepped down from that stagecoach wasn't what I'd bargained for at all. His eyes closed and the years fell away like autumn leaves. Part 1, The Unexpected Arrivals, April 12, 1881. The storm had been building since dawn, stacking itself against the western horizon in shades of bruised purple and slate gray. By afternoon, the clouds had swallowed the sun whole, turning the Texas prairie into something mean and restless. Garrett Blake stood on his porch at 36 years old, one shoulder propped against a rough-hewn post, watching the distant road with the patient intensity of a man accustomed to solitude. The wind carried the smell of rain and cedar, whipping his dark hair across his forehead. He didn't bother pushing it back. His gray eyes remained fixed on the ribbon of dirt that wound through his property past the cottonwoods toward the main house. The stagecoach was late, not unusual given the weather, but it grated against his sense of order nonetheless. Garrett had built his life on predictability, on the reliable rhythm of cattle land and honest work. 2,000 acres of tough prairie grass, rocky soil, and stubborn longhorns. He'd carved it from nothing after coming home from a war that had tried to break him, and he'd done it alone. He'd placed that advertisement in the Austin Herald 6 weeks ago with specific parameters. Housekeeper wanted, single woman, room and board provided, $8 monthly, domestic skills required, apply in writing. He'd received exactly 3 responses. 2 were barely literate, the handwriting of women who'd learned their letters late, if at all. The third came from a Miss Sarah Reed of San Antonio, written in a careful, educated hand that suggested either genuine refinement or a skillful forgery. Her letter had been brief, professional, and curiously devoid of personal detail. She could cook, she could clean, she could manage a household. She required immediate placement and asked no questions about wages or conditions. That last part should have raised flags. In Garrett's experience, people who didn't ask questions were usually running from answers. But he'd been desperate. The house had fallen into a state of benign neglect since Mrs. Garrett, no relation, but she'd never minded the coincidence, had moved to Austin to live with her daughter the previous winter. Garrett had managed well enough on his own. He was a rancher, not a helpless fool. But the accumulation of unwashed dishes, dusty corners, and shirts mended, then mended again, had finally convinced him that pride was a poor substitute for practicality. So he'd sent Sarah Reed a return letter with travel funds, $4.50 for the stagecoach from San Antonio through San Marcos, and instructions. She'd replied with a telegram. Arriving April 12th, stop. Grateful for opportunity. Stop. S. Reed. Today was April 12th. The stagecoach was 3 hours late. Thunder rumbled across the prairie, low and threatening. Garrett's black gelding Flint shifted nervously in the corral ears, flattened against his skull. The ranch hands had already secured the outbuildings and brought the near pasture cattle closer to shelter. Jed Marcus, Tom, Billy, and Sam Goodman, all of them knew their business without being told. Garrett had sent them to the bunkhouse an hour ago. Whatever was coming, weather or otherwise, he'd face it first. The stagecoach finally appeared through the curtain of dust and distance, rocking violently over the rutted road. Tucker, the driver, was pushing the team hard, trying to beat the storm. Garrett straightened his hand instinctively, moving to adjust his hat, a gesture left over from a time when such things had mattered to him. The coach clattered into the yard with considerably less dignity than it had likely left Austin with that morning. Mud caked the wheels. One door hung slightly askew. Tucker, a grizzled man in his 50s, whom Garrett knew from previous supply. Runs looked thoroughly done with the day. Blake, Tucker called down, his voice rough as gravel. Got your delivery, though. I'll tell you straight, this ain't what your wire specified. Garrett's jaw tightened. Explain. But Tucker was already climbing down, moving to open the passenger door, with the weariness of a man who'd witnessed too much strangeness to be surprised by any of it. Best you see for yourself. The door swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a woman's hand appeared, gripping the door frame with white-knuckled intensity. The hand was small, fine-boned, but the grip suggested steel beneath the skin. Sarah Reed stepped down. She was younger than Garrett had anticipated, perhaps 24, though her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that aged a person beyond years. Dark brown hair had been pinned severely back from a pale face marked by high cheekbones and a mouth set in a grim line of determination. Her dress was serviceable, gray wool mud-splattered and travel-worn, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Deep brown, almost black, and haunted by something Garrett recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. The look of someone who'd survived something they shouldn't have had to. She met his gaze directly, unflinching. Mr. Blake, I'm Sarah Reed. I apologize for the delay. The storm. Ain't the storm that's the problem? Tucker interrupted, then gestured back toward the coach. It's the extras. Sarah's composure cracked just for an instant. Her hand moved to her throat, then dropped. They're with me. Your letter made no mention, Garrett began, but then the rest of his sentence died in his throat. 2 children emerged from the stagecoach. The first was a girl of perhaps 7, all sharp angles and serious eyes beneath a tangle of brown curls that had escaped whatever pins had once contained them. She wore a dress that might have been blue once, but had faded to the color of old sky, and she descended the coach steps with the cautious deliberation of someone expecting the ground to disappear beneath her feet. The second child was smaller, 5 or 6, with blonde hair and 2 braids and a softer face, still holding on to the rounded sweetness of early childhood. She clutched a cloth doll with one hand while the other gripped her sister's sleeve. Both girls immediately moved to Sarah's sides, pressing against her skirts like small ships seeking harbor. The silence that followed was broken only by thunder and the restless stamping of the coach horses. Garrett stared. He'd prepared for one woman, one housekeeper, one person to manage his household in exchange for fair wages and a roof that didn't leak. He had not prepared for this, for the sudden invasion of his carefully maintained solitude by a woman with secrets in her eyes and 2 little girls who looked at him like he might be just another person about to send them away. Mr. Blake, Sarah said quietly, and her voice held the steady calm of someone making a final stand. I apologize for the lack of notice, if you'll allow me to explain. Inside, Garrett heard himself say. His voice came out rougher than intended. Storm's coming. Tucker, help me with the buzz. Ain't many, Tucker muttered, hauling down a single battered trunk and 2 small bundles. Traveling light. Traveling fast, Garrett thought. Running. He took the trunk surprisingly heavy for its size and gestured toward the house with a jerk of his head. Go on then before the rain hits. Sarah hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this constituted acceptance or merely postponement of rejection. Then the first fat raindrops began to fall, and the decision was made for her. She gathered her skirts in one hand, placed her other hand on the older girl's shoulder, and moved toward the porch with the determined stride of someone who'd learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. The younger girl followed her doll clutched tight. The older girl cast one long, measuring look at Garrett, assessing him, filing away information, already calculating risks, before she too climbed the steps. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened completely. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the yard to mud and the distant prairie to a gray smudge of water and wind. Lightning split the darkness, followed immediately by thunder so loud the house timbers groaned. The younger girl whimpered and pressed closer to Sarah. Garrett shouldered open the front door and stood aside. In. The interior of the house was dim, cool, and exactly as he'd left it that morning. Functional, clean enough, but bearing the unmistakable mark of a man living alone. The main room served as kitchen dining area and sitting space all at once, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a heavy wooden table in the center. His father had built that table from solid oak in 1852. It could seat 10, though it hadn't held more than Garrett and the occasional ranch hand in over a decade. 2 doors led off to bedrooms. A third led to what had once been his mother's sewing room, but now held only dust and memories. Sarah stepped inside, water dripping from her hem. The girls followed, their eyes huge as they took in their surroundings. Garrett noticed the older one's gaze went immediately to the exits. The front door, the back door visible through the kitchen, the windows, calculating escape routes. He knew that habit. He'd developed it himself long ago in a different war, in a different life. Tucker deposited the trunk with a grunt, tipped his hat to Sarah, a gesture of respect that spoke well of the woman if Tucker considered her due courtesy, and ducked back out into the storm. Good luck, Blake, he called over the rain. You're going to need it. Then the door closed and Garrett was alone with 3 strangers in a house that had been silent for so long, he'd forgotten how small it became when filled with other people. Sarah drew herself up straighter, which was impressive, considering she couldn't have stood more than 5 feet 4 inches in her boots. Mr. Blake, I owe you honesty. When I applied for this position, I was unaware that circumstances would require me to bring my... She hesitated, the pause so brief Garrett almost missed it. My charges with me. Not her daughters, then. Charges. If my presence is unacceptable under these conditions, I understand, Sarah continued, but I would ask that you allow us to shelter here until the storm passes and the next stage arrives. I have funds enough for our return fare. She had a good voice, Garrett noted distantly. Educated, Eastern maybe, or at least schooled somewhere that cared about such things. It didn't match the desperation he had sensed in her letters. Their names, he said. Sarah blinked. I'm sorry. The girls, they have names, I assume. Oh, something flickered across her face, relief perhaps that he hadn't immediately ordered them back into the storm. She placed a hand on the older girl's shoulder. This is Emma. Her hand moved to the younger child's head, a gesture so naturally protective it spoke of long habit. And this is Lily. Emma and Lily, Garrett repeated. The names hung in the air, making the children reel in a way that simple observation hadn't. They yours. Another hesitation. They're in my care. Which wasn't an answer, but Garrett let it lie. He had plenty of his own questions he didn't care to answer. He moved past them to the fireplace, kneeling to build up the fire that had been banked low since morning. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were licking up around the larger logs, casting warm light across the room. The girls inched closer to the heat, though they kept Sarah between themselves and Garrett like a human shield. You're soaked through, Garrett said, still not looking at them. There's a bedroom through that door. Used to be my mother's. Should be linens in the chest, quilts on the bed. Get yourselves dry. I'll see about supper. Mr. Blake, Sarah began. We'll talk after you're dry and fed, Garrett interrupted. Go on. For a moment, he thought she might argue, but then the younger girl, Lily, sneezed a tiny wet sound that seemed to tip the balance. Sarah nodded once, gathered the girls, and retreated to the bedroom. The door closed softly behind them. Garrett remained by the fire listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet murmur of voices from the other room. He could make out Sarah's low tones reassuring and the higher uncertain responses of the children. What the hell had he gotten himself into? He rose, moved to the kitchen, and began pulling out supplies for a simple meal. Beans, cornbread, salt pork. Not fancy but hot and filling. As he worked, his mind turned over the problem with the methodical precision he applied to everything else in his life. Facts. Sarah Reed had traveled from San Antonio with two children she claimed were in her care. She'd been intentionally vague in her correspondence. She had funds enough to pay a return fare which suggested she wasn't destitute. But if that were true, why apply for a housekeeping position on a remote ranch in the middle of nowhere? She was running. The question was from what? The bedroom door opened. Sarah emerged first, changed into a simple brown dress that was dry but no less worn than the first. She'd unpinned her hair and rebraided it into a long plait over one shoulder. Without the severe styling, she looked younger, softer still. Wary but less like a woman about to bolt. Emma and Lily followed also in dry clothes, faded cotton dresses that spoke of careful mending and meager circumstances. Lily still clutched her doll. Emma's hand rested on her sister's shoulder in unconscious mimicry of Sarah's earlier gesture. Sit, Garrett said, nodding toward the table. Food's almost ready. They sat, the girls perched on the edge of their chairs like birds ready to take flight. Sarah folded her hands in her lap with the composed stillness of someone who'd learned to wait. Garrett served the meal in silence, ladling beans onto tin plates, adding chunks of cornbread, still warm from the Dutch oven. He poured milk for the girls fresh that morning and from his neighbor's dairy cow, 5 cents a quart, and coffee for himself and Sarah Black strong, the way he preferred it. The beans had cost him 12 cents a pound, the salt pork and another 12. Simple fare but honest. Lily stared at her plate as if unsure whether she was allowed to eat. Emma looked to Sarah, who nodded once. Only then did the children pick up their spoons. They ate with the focused intensity of people who'd known hunger. Not the comfortable temporary hunger of missing a meal, but the deeper kind. The kind that taught you to never waste food, never take fullness for granted, never assume there would be more tomorrow. Garrett knew that hunger too. He'd learned it in the winter of '64 when Sherman's march had left the South, stripped bare and starving. When the edges had been taken off, when Lily's eyes were growing heavy and Emma's rigid posture had softened slightly, Sarah finally spoke. You're owed an explanation. No, Garrett said. I'm owed honesty. You can keep your explanations if you like, but if you're staying even temporarily, I need to know whether someone's going to come looking for these girls. Whether there's trouble following you. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Garrett thought she might refuse to answer. Then she lifted her eyes to his, and the weight of what he saw there made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. No one is looking for them, she said quietly. Not anymore. Their parents died last winter. Fever took them both. There's no other family willing to take them in. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Lily's eyes filled with tears, though she made no sound. Emma put an arm around her sister and glared at Garrett with sudden fierceness, as if daring him to say something that would hurt Lily further. Then why the secrecy? Garrett pressed, keeping his voice level. Why not mention them in your letter? Because every position I've applied for in the past 6 months has rejected me the moment they learned I came with children. Sarah said, her voice gaining strength even as pain flickered across her face. I thought perhaps if I could prove myself capable, first demonstrate that I could manage the work, that you might be willing to reconsider. That's a hell of an assumption. It was the only option I had left, Mr. Blake. I've exhausted every other avenue, every charity home, every aid society, every possible placement. No one wants 2 girls with no inheritance and no connections. And I will not, her voice sharpened with sudden steel, I will not see them separated or sent to some workhouse where they'll be treated as nothing more than free labor. Lily had begun to cry silently, tears sliding down her round cheeks. Emma's arm tightened around her sister, and she continued to stare at Garrett with that unsettling mixture of fear and defiance. Garrett set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. How old are you, Emma? The girl blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. 7, sir. Lily's 5. And you can read? A cautious nod. Yes, sir. Sarah taught us. Can you both work age-appropriate work? He clarified, seeing Sarah stiffen. Collecting eggs, feeding chickens, simple mending, not heavy labor. Emma's chin lifted. We can work. We're not useless. Didn't say you were. Garrett turned his attention back to Sarah. You've been caring for them for 6 months on nothing but savings and what you could earn from mending work. Yes. And you're 24 years old. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. How did you know? Your application letter. You mentioned 5 years of household experience. Started at 19, which puts you at 24 now. 24 years old, and she'd taken on the full responsibility of 2 orphan children with no legal obligation, no support, and no resources. Either Sarah Reed was a saint or a fool. Garrett strongly suspected she was neither. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder growing distant. Rain still fell, but softer now, a steady drumbeat rather than a deluge. The fire crackled. Lily's tears had slowed, and she'd begun to nod against her sister's shoulder. Garrett stood, and all 3 of them tensed immediately. He ignored the reaction and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked darkness of his land. 2,000 acres of tough prairie grass, rocky soil, and stubborn cattle. He'd built this ranch from nothing after returning from a war that had tried to break him. He'd chosen isolation, deliberately crafted a life where he answered to no one and relied on nothing but his own strength and will. These 3 strangers in his house represented everything he'd worked to avoid. Complication, dependence, the messy, unpredictable chaos of other people's needs and histories. He should send them away, make sure they had funds, see them safely to the next stage, return to the quiet order of his carefully constructed solitude. But when he turned back, he found himself looking at Lily, small, exhausted Lily with her cloth doll and her silent tears. And something in his chest cracked just enough to let in a sliver of light he'd thought he'd sealed away years ago. 2 weeks, he heard himself say. You work. You prove you can manage this house and not interfere with the ranch operation. And we'll see about making it permanent. But he held up a hand as relief flooded Sarah's face. There are conditions. Anything, Sarah said immediately. The girls stay out of the ranch hand's way. They don't wander past the creek to the south or into the north pastures. They listen when I tell them something, and they listen when you tell them something. This is a working ranch, not a playground. It's dangerous for anyone who doesn't know what they're doing. Understood. Understood. And you, Garrett continued, fixing Sarah with a hard look. You tell me if someone comes looking. I don't care what it is or who they are. If there's trouble, I need to know about it before it arrives on my doorstep. There won't be trouble, Sarah said, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely certain of that. 2 weeks, Garrett repeated. After that, we'll talk the terms if things work out. If they don't, I'll pay your way to Austin and give you references for other positions. Fair. More than fair. Sarah's voice was thick with emotion she was clearly struggling to contain. Thank you, Mr. Blake. I promise you won't regret this. Garrett sincerely doubted that, but what he said was, get them to bed. Morning comes early on a ranch, and tomorrow you'll start learning your duties. Sarah nodded and rose gently, waking Lily and guiding both girls toward the bedroom. At the threshold, Emma turned back. Mr. Blake, her voice was small but clear. Will you really let us stay for real? Garrett met those serious 7-year-old eyes and saw in them a weariness that no child should have to carry. For now, he said, get some sleep. Emma nodded slowly, processing this, filing it away with whatever other information she'd gathered about him. Then she slipped through the door, and it closed behind them. Garrett was alone again in his house, but the silence felt different now, occupied, changed. He returned to the window, watching the last of the storm clouds break apart to reveal a slice of stars. The rain had softened to a drizzle. By morning, the sun would return, and with it, the hard work of running a ranch that had no patience for distraction or sentiment. He'd given them 2 weeks. That seemed reasonable. Long enough for Sarah to prove herself capable or reveal whatever trouble she was running from. Long enough for the girls to either adapt or demonstrate they were too much disruption for a working ranch. 2 weeks, and then he could return to the quiet, ordered life he'd built. But as Garrett banked the fire and prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the image of Lily's tears or Emma's protective fierceness or Sarah's exhausted determination. He couldn't forget the feeling that something essential had just shifted in his world. And somewhere in the deepest part of himself, the part he'd tried to bury along with everything else he'd lost, Garrett, Blake recognized the uncomfortable truth. His carefully constructed isolation had just taken its first real hit. The next 2 weeks were going to be considerably more complicated than he'd anticipated. Morning came with the relentless brightness peculiar to Texas after a storm. Garrett woke before dawn, as always, to the sound of roosters and the restless lowing of cattle in the near pasture. He dressed quickly in the dark. Work shirt, worn denims, boots that had seen 10 years of hard use. He emerged from his bedroom to find the main room empty and the house still silent. Good. He needed coffee and solitude before facing whatever this day was going to bring. But when he reached the kitchen, he found Sarah already there. She stood at the stove with her back to him, still in her nightgown, and wrapper, her long braid hanging down her back. She'd built up the fire and had coffee brewing. He could smell it, dark and strong, exactly how he took it. Her movements were efficient, practiced, those of someone who'd run a household before. "You're up early," Garrett said. Sarah jumped, spinning around with one hand pressed to her chest. "Mr. Blake, I didn't hear you. I'm sorry. I should have asked before using your kitchen." "It's fine." He moved past her to pour himself coffee, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she stepped aside. Still skittish, still ready to apologize for existing. "If you're making breakfast, there's eggs in the cold box and bacon in the larder." "I found them, thank you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "The girls are still sleeping. They were exhausted." "Let them rest then. Plenty of time to establish routines." Garrett took his coffee to the table and sat watching her work. She moved well in a kitchen, he'd give her that. No wasted motion, no fumbling with unfamiliar tools. She found the cast iron skillet, the spatula, the plates, all without having to search. "You've done this before," he observed. "Run a household." "I grew up in one that valued such skills." Sarah cracked eggs into the pan with practiced ease, and I worked as a companion for several years. Household management was part of my duties. "Where? San Antonio, most recently. Before that, Houston." "You're from Texas, then?" A slight pause. "No, I came here 5 years ago from Virginia." The word came out clipped, final, a door closing on further questions. Garrett let it drop. He'd get the full story eventually, or he wouldn't. Either way, pushing now would only make her more defensive. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, broken only by the sizzle of bacon and the scrape of forks on tin plates. Sarah had set aside portions for the girls, covering them with a cloth to keep them warm. She ate quickly, efficiently, like someone accustomed to taking meals standing or on the run. "I'll need to show you the house properly," Garrett said when they'd finished. "Where things are kept. What needs doing. The garden's been neglected. Hasn't been tended since Mrs. Garrett left. If you've got any skill with growing things, that would be useful come summer." "I can manage a garden. Washing's done on Mondays and Thursdays. There's a line out back and a good wash tub in the shed. Water comes from the well. It's clean, cold, and reliable. Don't ever let it get low without telling me." Sarah nodded, committing this to memory. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse mostly, but sometimes they'll come up for Sunday dinner if we're doing something special. There's 5 of them. Jed, Marcus, Tom, Billy, and Sam. They're good men, work hard, no trouble. They know to keep respectful around women. And the ranch work. What should I know about your schedule? I'm up before dawn and out until midday unless there's trouble. Back for dinner at 1 o'clock, then out again until dark. Cattle need checking, fences need mending, horses need training. Spring's calving season, so I'll be spending more time in the far pastures." He paused. "I'll need packed meals some days. Can you manage that?" "Of course." "Then we'll start there." Garrett rose, carrying his plate to the wash basin. "Get the girls fed and dressed. I'll show you around the property after morning chores. But there's one thing you should understand right now." Sarah turned to face him, her expression guarded. "This ranch runs on a schedule," Garrett said quietly. "Cattle don't care about convenience or comfort. Weather doesn't ask permission. Things break. Animals get sick. Problems arise without warning. I need to know you can handle that you won't fall apart if something goes wrong, or if I'm not here to solve every little crisis." "I won't fall apart, Mr. Blake." "See that you don't." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "And Sarah, call me Garrett. Mr. Blake was my father, and I'd rather not be reminded of him." He left before she could respond, stepping out into a morning scrubbed clean by yesterday's storm. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Puddles reflected the brightening sky. In the distance, his hands were already moving among the cattle, checking for storm damage or injury. This was his world. Solid, predictable, manageable. And for the next 2 weeks, he'd do his damnedest to keep it that way. 3 unexpected guests notwithstanding. Behind him through the open window, he heard the bedroom door open and the soft, wondering voice of Lily. "Sarah, is this really our home now?" And Sarah's response gentle but honest. "For a little while, sweetheart. For a little while." Garrett walked toward the barn, the weight of those words settling uncomfortably in his chest. A little while? 2 weeks. That was all this was. He needed to remember that. 4 days passed in a flurry of adjustment. Sarah attacked the house with the determination of a woman proving her worth, scrubbing floors that didn't strictly need scrubbing, reorganizing cupboards, mending curtains that had hung crooked for so long Garrett had stopped noticing. She moved through the rooms like a quiet storm, leaving order in her wake. The girls proved more challenging to categorize. Lily shadowed Sarah constantly those first days, rarely speaking above a whisper, her cloth doll always clutched in one small fist. But Emma was different. She observed everything with those sharp, calculating eyes, testing boundaries, with the strategic precision of a scout mapping enemy territory. On the 4th morning, Garrett came into the barn to check on a mare who'd seemed off her feed the previous evening and discovered Emma standing outside the stall, perfectly still, watching the horse with focused intensity. She wore one of her faded dresses and boots that were slightly too large, likely handed down or borrowed. Her hair had been braided by Sarah into 2 neat plaits, but already wisps were escaping around her face. "She's favoring her left foreleg," Emma said without turning around, "and she keeps looking at her flank. Might be colic." Garrett stopped short. "How do you know that?" "My papa had horses before." The last word carried the weight of everything that had come after. "He taught me to watch for signs. Horses can't tell you when something hurts, so you have to learn their language." Garrett moved to the stall, running his hand along the mare's neck. She was warm, restless, and yes, definitely favoring that leg. "Your papa taught you well." He said the same thing. Emma finally turned to look at him. "Will she be all right?" "If it's colic, we caught it early. I'll walk her. Keep her moving. Watch for the next few hours." He paused, considering. "You can help if Sarah doesn't need you." Something shifted in Emma's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening of that perpetual wariness. "I'd like that." So Garrett found himself walking circles in the paddock with a 7-year-old girl and a colicky mare, explaining the signs to watch for the treatments that work the delicate balance of knowing when to call the veterinarian from town, 10 miles away at $5 a visit, and when to trust your own judgment. Emma absorbed it all with the intensity of someone starving for knowledge, asking questions that showed she actually understood what he was telling her. "Why'd you choose ranching?" she asked, after they'd been walking for an hour. The mare was looking better, less agitated, more willing to graze. "Seemed like honest work," Garrett said. "And I like the quiet." "Do you still like it? The quiet, I mean, now that we're here." It was a surprisingly perceptive question from someone so young. Garrett glanced down at her. "Jury's still out." Emma nodded solemnly as if this was exactly the answer she'd expected. They walked in silence for a while longer. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool morning air. From the house, Garrett could hear the faint sounds of Sarah working, the rhythmic thump of rugs being beaten, the splash of water from the pump. Lily's higher voice calling something he couldn't make out, and Sarah's low, reassuring response. "Garrett," Emma said quietly, "Sarah says we have to be very good, that we can't mess this up because there's nowhere else to go." "Your sister know you're worried about that." "Lily doesn't worry about things the same way I do. She just gets sad. I have to worry enough for both of us." She said it matter-of-factly without self-pity, and Garrett recognized that tone too. The voice of someone who'd learned too young that survival required sacrifice. That's a heavy load for someone your size. Someone's got to carry it. They completed another circuit of the paddock in silence. When they returned the mare to her stall, recovered calm, no longer showing signs of distress, the morning had burned away into afternoon. They found Sarah on the back porch hanging laundry on the line strung between 2 posts. Sheets billowed in the breeze like white sails. Lily sat nearby on the steps, carefully sorting clothespins by size, a task that clearly had more to do with keeping her occupied than any practical purpose. "There you are," Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. "I was beginning to worry." "Mare had colic," Garrett explained. Emma helped walk her through it. Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Did she—" "She knows horses. Her father taught her." Something flickered across Sarah's face. Not grief exactly, but a tenderness mixed with regret. "Yes, he did. He was good with them." She smoothed her hands down her apron, a nervous gesture. "I've kept your dinner warm. And Emma, you need to wash up before you eat. You're covered in horse." Emma looked down at herself, seeming to notice for the first time the dust and hay clinging to her dress. "Oh, go on," Sarah said gently. Lily will help you, won't you, sweetheart?" Lily nodded and scrambled to her feet, taking her sister's hand. The two of them disappeared into the house, leaving Garrett and Sarah alone among the flapping sheets. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for letting her help. She needs to feel useful." "She was useful," Garrett said. "Girl's got a good eye. Spotted the problem before I did. Her father would have been proud." Sarah reached for another wet sheet, shaking it out with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved with careful control, as if she was channeling emotion into physical work. "How long were you with their family?" Garrett asked. 3 years. I was hired as a companion to their mother. She was kind to me, more than kind." Sarah's voice softened with memory. "When she fell ill, I cared for her as best I could. At the end, she made me promise to look after the girls, to keep them together no matter what." She clipped the sheet to the line, her jaw tightening. "I intend to keep that promise." Garrett should have gone inside, should have left her to her work and her memories. But something kept him rooted there, watching the way determination and vulnerability warred in her expression. "The mare's name is Dancer," he said finally. "If Emma wants to check on her later, that'd be fine. Girl should know her patient recovered." He left Sarah standing among the sheets, her expression unreadable, and went inside to the dinner she'd kept warm. The house smelled of bread and stewed meat and something he couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to home. The days developed a rhythm after that. Garrett woke before dawn and found Sarah already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, breakfast in progress. The girls would emerge sleepy-eyed and quiet, eating quickly before beginning whatever tasks Sarah had assigned them. Emma took to following Garrett around the ranch when her chores were finished, absorbing everything he told her about cattle, horses, land management, weather signs. Lily stayed closer to home, helping Sarah in the garden that was slowly coming back to life under determined care. By the end of the first week, Garrett had stopped thinking of the house as empty when he returned at midday, had stopped being surprised by the sound of Lily's laughter or Emma's questions or Sarah's quiet humming as she worked. The hands noticed too. Jed commented that the ranch felt livelier, and even gruff Sam admitted it was nice to smell fresh bread when the wind blew right. On Sunday, Sarah prepared a dinner that brought all 5 ranch hands up to the house with their hats in their hands and genuine gratitude in their eyes. She'd made pot roast with vegetables from the newly revived garden fresh rolls and a dried apple pie that made Billy declare he'd died and gone to heaven. The men were respectful, careful not to curse patient, when Lily shyly offered them more coffee with trembling hands. Garrett watched from the head of the table, saying little but noting everything. The way Sarah moved through the room with quiet confidence, ensuring everyone had enough. The way Emma sat up straighter when the hands complimented her help with the vegetables. The way Lily's smile grew wider each time someone thanked her. After the hands returned to the bunkhouse full and content, Garrett helped Sarah with the dishes, an offer that clearly surprised her. They worked in companionable silence, her washing him, drying the girls playing quietly in the corner, with a set of carved wooden animals that had been his as a boy. "We're past halfway through your trial," Sarah said suddenly. "I suppose you'll be making your decision soon." Garrett set down the plate he'd been drying. "And if I asked you to stay permanently?" Sarah's hands stilled in the washwater. "Are you asking, considering it?" She turned to face him, soapy water dripping from her hands. "You've made it clear you value your solitude. We're the opposite of that. We're noise and complication and disruption. Why would you willingly choose that?" "Place needs a housekeeper," he said. "You are good at the work. The girls aren't in as much trouble as I expected. Seems practical." "Practical?" Sarah's mouth twisted slightly. That's your reason. You want a different one? I want the truth, Garrett. Her voice was steady but insistent. Because if we stay, if we make this permanent, I need to know we're not just a convenience that you'll regret when the newness wears off, and you remember how much you prefer being alone. Garrett leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. This house was built for a family. My parents raised 4 kids here. After they died, after my brothers and sister moved on, it's just been me. And I didn't realize how much that mattered until you 3 showed up and reminded me what it used to sound like. Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide and dark in the lamplight. That's the most I've heard you say at one time since we arrived. Don't get used to it. A small smile tugged at her mouth. If we stay, and I'm not saying we will not until you actually make a formal offer, but if we do, I need you to understand something. Those girls have lost everyone. They've been passed over, rejected, told their burdens. If we stay, they're going to start hoping, start believing this is real. And if you change your mind later, if you decide you were wrong and this was a mistake, it will break them in ways I'm not sure they can recover from. I don't make offers I don't intend to keep, Garrett said quietly. If I ask you to stay, it's because I mean it. Then ask me properly, not considering it or seems practical. Ask me like you mean it. Garrett held her gaze, seeing the challenge there, the fierce protectiveness, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. This woman who'd given up everything for 2 children, who weren't even hers by blood, who'd traveled across Texas with nothing but determination and hope, who stood in his kitchen with his soapy hands demanding that he be clear about his intentions. She deserved honesty. Stay, he said, all 3 of you, not as a trial, as permanent residents of this ranch. I'll pay fair wages, provide room and board, and make sure those girls have what they need. In return, you manage the house and let me teach Emma about horses if she's interested. And when Lily is old enough, maybe she can help in the garden or with the chickens or whatever suits her. This doesn't have to be complicated, Sarah. It can just be an arrangement that works for everyone. From the corner, Lily's voice piped up, Sarah, can we stay? Please, can we stay? Neither adult had realized the girls were listening. Emma stood now too, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands clenched tight at her sides. Lily clutched her doll, eyes huge with hope and fear in equal measure. Sarah looked at Garrett one more time, searching his face for certainty, trustworthiness, simple sincerity. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. Yes, she said to the girls, we can stay. Lily's shriek of joy was loud enough to startle the chickens in their coop. She launched herself at Sarah, wrapping small arms around her waist. Emma moved more slowly, but her tight control had cracked enough to let genuine relief show through. Really, Emma asked, looking at Garrett. You really mean it? This is our home now. It's your home, Garrett confirmed. Long as you want it to be. Emma nodded, processing this, then did something unexpected. She crossed to Garrett and stuck out her hand like she'd seen adults do. Thank you, sir. We won't let you down. Garrett shook her small hand gravely. I know. That night, after the girls had been put to bed and Sarah had retired to her own room, Garrett sat alone on the porch listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, wind through the grass, an owl hunting somewhere beyond the barn. He'd just permanently altered the course of his carefully controlled life, taken on responsibility for 3 people who were basically strangers, committed himself to noise and complication and all the messy unpredictability he'd worked so hard to avoid. And somehow it didn't feel like a mistake. But on the morning of the 13th day, everything changed. Garrett woke to shouting. He was out of bed and halfway to the main room before his brain fully caught up with his instincts. Heart pounding, muscles tensed for whatever threat had invaded his home. But when he threw open his bedroom door, what he found wasn't an intruder or an accident or any of the disasters his mind had conjured. It was a woman, tall, imposing, dressed in black silk that must have cost more than most families earned in a month, standing in his kitchen like she owned it. She held a piece of paper in one gloved hand and regarded Sarah with the cold assessment of someone evaluating livestock. You cannot seriously expect me to believe you're providing adequate care, the woman was saying, her voice sharp with cultivated disdain. Living in this primitive situation. No proper schooling, no suitable society. They have everything they need, Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. The girls were behind her, both in their nightgowns, both pressed against her like they were trying to disappear. "Who the hell are you?" Garrett's voice cut through the room like a blade. The woman's attention snapped to him, and her expression shifted from disdain to calculation in an instant. "Mr. Blake, I presume. I am Catherine Hartwell, maternal aunt to these children, and I've come to take them home where they belong." Everything in the room went very, very still. "They are home," Sarah said barely above a whisper. Catherine Hartwell's smile was thin and cold. "We'll see what the court has to say about that." "Won't we? I have a lawyer, Miss Reed, and evidence that you've been harboring these children without proper legal authority. Did you think I wouldn't find you eventually?" She produced another paper from her reticule, unfolding it with deliberate slowness. "This is an affidavit signed by 3 witnesses testifying to your unstable situation. Moving from place to place, no permanent address, no means of support until quite recently." Catherine's eyes gleamed with triumph. "And there's the matter of your deception. Telling everyone these children were yours when in fact they're not your daughters at all, or they misread. They're your half-sisters, born to your father and his second wife after your mother's death. Half-sisters you appropriated after their parents' death with no legal right whatsoever." The room spun. Garrett's gaze snapped to Sarah, who had gone white as death. "That's not," Sarah started, but her voice failed. "It's all documented," Catherine continued smoothly. "Their parents' marriage certificate, birth records, your father's will which made no provision for you, the illegitimate daughter he barely acknowledged. Tell me, Miss Reed, what exactly gives you the right to determine these children's future? When you're nothing but a bastard, your father refused to claim." The word hit like a physical blow. Lily began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Emma's jaw was clenched so tight Garrett thought her teeth might crack. "Get out," Garrett said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out of my house, now." "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Blake," Catherine said coolly. "These children are blood relations, and I intend to see them properly placed with me in a respectable household. Not in this rough frontier situation with a woman of questionable morality and a man who thought he could buy himself a convenient family. I said get out. I'll be back, Mr. Blake, with the sheriff and proper documentation. And when I do return, those children will be leaving with me." She folded her papers with crisp efficiency and moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at Sarah with something that might have been pity if it weren't so thoroughly coated in contempt. "You should have known better than to think you could keep them. Girls like you never get to keep anything." Then she was gone, her carriage rattling away down the drive, leaving destruction in her wake. The silence after her departure was absolute. Lily's tears had become sobs muffled against Sarah's nightgown. Emma stood rigid, her face blank with shock. And Sarah looked like every foundation she'd built her life on had just been revealed as sand. "Sarah," Garrett began. "Don't." She held up a shaking hand. "Please, just don't." She gathered the girls and retreated to the bedroom, the door closing with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Garrett stood alone in his kitchen, staring at the space where Catherine Hartwell had stood, and felt the ground shifting beneath everything he'd thought he understood. Half-sisters, legal challenges, a past Sarah had never mentioned, and secrets that were apparently about to tear his household apart just when it had started to feel like something worth keeping. Dawn arrived too quickly, washing the Texas sky in shades of pale gold. Garrett rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, his body moving through morning routines with mechanical precision, while his mind churned through every possible outcome, every conceivable solution. He found Sarah already in the main room, though not in the kitchen where she'd spent every morning for the past 2 weeks. She stood by the window, still in the same dress from yesterday, her hair unpinned and hanging loose around her shoulders. On the table sat her battered trunk, already packed. The 2 small bundles that had arrived with them rested beside it. She didn't turn when he entered. "Coffee's not made. I'm sorry. I thought it best to start packing instead." Garrett moved to the stove, began building the fire himself. "Unpacking would be more useful." "You don't understand what she can do." Sarah's voice was hollow, scraped raw. "Catherine has money, connections, legal standing. I have nothing, no claim, no rights. The law will side with blood relation every time." "Maybe," Garrett filled the coffee pot with water from the pitcher, measured out grounds with steady hands. But you're not running. Not this time. Sarah finally turned to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face blotchy from tears she tried to hide. This strong, determined woman who traveled across Texas on nothing but hope now looked defeated by words and papers and the cruel machinery of the law. You don't know what you're asking. She'll destroy you, too, just for standing in her way. Catherine doesn't forgive, she doesn't forget, and she certainly doesn't lose. Then she's about to learn something new. Garrett set the coffee pot on the stove, turned to face her fully. That woman came into my house, threatened people under my protection. That doesn't stand, not on my land. Your protection, Sarah's laugh was bitter, broken. Garrett, I lied to you, not directly but by omission. I let you believe they were orphans I'd taken in out of charity, when the truth is they're my half-sisters, my father's legitimate children from his real marriage, while I'm just the bastard daughter he refused to acknowledge. Catherine's right. I have no legal claim to them. I'm just Thomas Hartwell's mistake. Then we'll get you rights. How? Sarah's voice cracked. She has lawyers, she has money, she has standing in society. I have nothing. You have me. Garrett crossed to her, did something he'd never done before. He touched her face, his rough, calloused hand cradling her cheek with surprising gentleness. And maybe that's enough. Sarah's breath caught. A tear slid down her cheek, dampening his palm. Why would you do this? Why would you fight for us? Because in 2 weeks you have made this house feel more like home than it has in 10 years, Garrett thought. Because Emma's questions make me remember why I love this land. Because Lily's laughter is a sound I didn't know I was missing. Because you've worked harder than anyone I've ever known and asked for nothing in return except a chance. But what he said was, because it's right. Because those girls deserve better than being used as pawns in whatever game that woman is playing. And because I'm not in the habit of letting bullies win. From the bedroom, Emma's voice called out, small and scared. Sarah, are we really leaving? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then called back, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. No, sweetheart, we're staying. We're going to fight. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of his rough frontier house with dawn breaking over the Texas prairie, Garrett Blake understood that he'd just committed himself to a battle that might cost him everything. But as Sarah's hand came up to cover his, her fingers cold and trembling, he found he didn't care about the condom. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you hadn't realized it until they were threatened. The morning stretched into afternoon with the weight of unspoken dread hanging over everything. Sarah went through the motions of her daily tasks with mechanical precision. Breakfast prepared but barely touched. Dishes washed in silence. The girls stayed close, Lily refusing to let Sarah out of her sight, Emma watching the road with the vigilance of a sentry expecting attack. Garrett left shortly after their conversation, muttering something about town and business that needed handling. He returned 3 hours later with Sheriff Tom Bridger, a weathered man in his 50s whose steady eyes and calm demeanor suggested he'd seen enough trouble to know the difference between real threats and empty ones. Now they sat around the kitchen table, Garrett, Sarah, and the sheriff, while the girls played quietly in the corner, their ears undoubtedly tuned to every word despite their apparent focus on the wooden animals. Mrs. Hartwell came to see me this morning. Sheriff Bridger said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Had quite a story about stolen children and fraudulent guardianship. Wanted me to remove those girls immediately. He paused, taking a sip of the coffee Sarah had poured with shaking hands. I told her I'd need to investigate the situation before taking any action. Due diligence, I said. And Garrett's jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid with barely contained tension. And I'm here to hear your side, Miss Reed, because Catherine Hartwell strikes me as a woman more interested in winning than in what it's actually right. The sheriff's gaze settled on Sarah with surprising gentleness. Why don't you start from the beginning? Truth now, all of it. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white. For a long moment, Garrett thought she might refuse, might retreat behind that carefully constructed wall of privacy she'd maintained since arriving. But then she drew a deep breath and began to speak. My mother was a seamstress in Richmond, she said quietly. She died when I was 12. Before she passed, she told me my father was a gentleman named Thomas Hartwell, that he'd promised to marry her but married someone else instead when his family arranged a better match. She never asked him for anything, never told him she was carrying his child. She raised me alone. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes had gone distant. After she died, I had no one. I ended up in a charity home until I was 16, then worked as a maid, a seamstress's assistant, whatever I could find. I never contacted Thomas Hartwell. I wanted nothing from him. But he found you, Sheriff Bridger said. It wasn't a question. His first wife died when I was 20. He hired investigators to locate me. I never knew why. Guilt, perhaps, or loneliness. He asked me to come to San Antonio. Offered me employment as a companion to his new wife. Sarah's mouth twisted slightly. Margaret Hartwell was young, frail, and kind. She was also pregnant with Emma. So I became part of their household. As an employee, nothing more. Thomas never acknowledged our relationship publicly. I was introduced as a distant cousin who'd fallen on hard times. But Margaret knew the truth, and she didn't care. She said I was family, whether Thomas admitted it or not. Sarah's voice softened. When Emma was born, Margaret asked me to be her godmother. When Lily came 2 years later, the same. Margaret's health was never good after Lily's birth, and she relied on me more and more. The Aunt Mrs. Hartwell, where was she during all this? Garrett asked. In Boston. She and Margaret weren't close. They'd been raised separately after their parents divorced. Different worlds, different values. Catherine visited once shortly after Lily was born and made it clear she disapproved of everything. Thomas's modest business, the household, Margaret's health, even the children themselves. She said Emma was too willful and Lily too delicate. Margaret asked her to leave. They hadn't spoken since. Sheriff Bridger set down his coffee cup with a thoughtful expression. So when the fever came, Margaret died first. She made me promise to look after the girls to make sure they stayed together. Thomas was devastated. He truly loved her, I think. He caught the fever 3 days later while sitting vigil at her grave. Before he died, he was delirious, barely coherent. But he called for me, held my hand, and whispered, "They're yours now." Sarah's voice cracked. I don't know if he meant it legally or if it was just fever talk, but I kept my promise to Margaret. Did he leave a will? The sheriff asked. If he did, I never saw it. The landlord came within a week demanding back rent. Thomas's business had failed months before. He'd kept it from Margaret to avoid worrying her. There was no money, no property, nothing. The landlord sold the furniture to cover what was owed. I took the girls and what few belongings we could carry, and we left. And you've been running ever since, Garrett said quietly. Sarah nodded. I tried to find legitimate placement. Orphanages, aid societies, church groups. Everyone said the same thing. They couldn't take two sisters together, and I had no legal standing to make demands about their care. Some wanted to separate them immediately. I couldn't let that happen. So I kept them with me, moved from place to place, took whatever work I could find. Mrs. Hartwell's affidavit claims you've been deceiving people, Sheriff Bridger said. Says you've been telling people they're your daughters. I never claimed they were my daughters by birth, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. But they are mine in every way that matters. I've cared for them since they were babies. I've fed them, clothed them, taught them to read and write. I've sat up with them through nightmares and illness. I've been their mother in everything but name because their real mother asked me to be. That's not deception, Sheriff. That's love. The room fell silent. From the corner, Lily's voice piped up, small but clear. Sarah is our mother. She's the only one we have. Emma stood moving to the table with her characteristic directness. If that mean lady tries to take us, we'll run away. We'll keep running until we're old enough to decide for ourselves. Emma, Sarah started, but the girl cut her off. I mean it. She didn't care about us when Mama was alive. She didn't come when Papa died. She didn't look for us when we had nowhere to go. She only showed up now because she wants to be cruel. Sheriff Bridger studied the girl with something like respect in his weathered face. That's a heavy accusation from someone so young. That doesn't make it wrong, Emma shot back. The sheriff's mouth twitched with what might have been a suppressed smile. No, I suppose it doesn't. He turned back to Sarah. Here's the situation as I see it. Mrs. Hartwell has legal standing as a blood relative. You have no formal legal claim, in a court that puts you at a disadvantage. Sarah's face went pale, but she nodded. She'd known this was coming. However, the sheriff continued, the law also considers the best interests of the children. And from what I can see, these girls are well cared for, healthy, educated, clearly attached to you. That counts for something. Additionally, Mrs. Hartwell's sudden interest after years of absence raises questions about her motives. So what do we do? Garrett asked. We document everything. Sarah, I'll need you to write out a full account of your relationship to these girls, their parents' wishes, the circumstances that brought you here. Get statements from anyone who knew you in San Antonio, anyone who can testify to your care of these children. He pulled out paper and pencil, set them on the table. And Garrett, I'll need to know your role in this, why you're housing them, what your intentions are. It's permanent, Garrett said without hesitation. They're part of my household. I've offered Miss Reed employment as my housekeeper. They're under my protection. That helps, but it's not enough to counter blood relation claims. Sheriff Bridger stood collecting his hat. I'll do what I can to slow this down. Give you time to build a case, but I'll be straight with you. Mrs. Hartwell has money and connections. She'll bring in lawyers. You'll need to be prepared for a real fight. After the sheriff left, the house felt smaller, somehow the walls pressing in with the weight of impending conflict. Sarah sat at the table, long after the others had moved away, staring at the blank paper. Garrett watched her from across the room, noting the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands kept clenching and unclenching. You should have told me, he said finally, about being their half-sister. Sarah's head snapped up. Would it have changed your decision to let us stay? I don't know, maybe, but you should have given me the choice. I gave you all the truth that mattered, she said, her voice hard with defensive anger. They're in my care. I love them. I'll do anything to protect them. Those are the important facts, Garrett. The rest is just complications. Complications that are about to tear this household apart. He moved closer, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. I can't help you if you keep hiding things. Sarah's eyes flashed. You want more secrets? Fine. My mother died of consumption in a charity ward because no doctor would treat a poor seamstress. I spent 4 years in a home where they taught us that we were worthless. I watched Thomas Hartwell pretend I didn't exist in public while privately asking if I'd like a real family, as if he could erase 20 years of abandonment with employment and false kindness. Her voice had risen, words tumbling out with the force of long suppressed fury. I've been called bastard, thief, liar. I've been told I'm not good enough, not legitimate enough, not worthy enough to exist. And then I found Margaret and the girls. And for the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me like I mattered, like I was family. And when she died, I promised I wouldn't let them suffer the way I did. So yes, I have secrets, Garrett. But none of them changed the fact that I would die before I let Catherine Hartwell take those girls. The silence after her outburst was deafening. Sarah's chest heaved with the force of her breathing, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She looked raw, exposed, every carefully constructed defense stripped away. Garrett reached across the table and took her hand. She flinched but didn't pull away. Then we fight, he said simply. Whatever it takes, we fight. Sarah stared at their joined hands, his rough and scarred from years of hard work, hers smaller but no less marked by labor. Why, she whispered, why would you risk so much for us? Because you're brave and fierce, and you've survived things that would have broken most people, Garrett thought. Because those girls deserve to grow up with someone who loves them. Because this house has been silent for too long, and you three brought it back to life. But what he said was, because it's right. Now stop asking questions and start writing that statement. We have work to do. 3 days after Catherine's visit on a Monday morning, a man arrived from Austin. Slick-suited, sharp-eyed, carrying a leather case full of documents. He introduced himself as Harrison Blake, attorney at law, and Garrett's stomach dropped as he registered the last name. Cousin, Harrison said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Been a long time. Garrett stood on his porch, blocking the entrance to his house, every muscle tense. What are you doing here, Harrison? Business, I'm afraid. I represent Mrs. Catherine Hartwell in a rather delicate family matter. Harrison's gaze drifted past Garrett to where Sarah stood visible through the doorway. I believe you're harboring 2 minor children who legally belong in Mrs. Hartwell's custody. I'm here to facilitate their peaceful transfer. They're not going anywhere, Garrett said flatly. Ah, but Garrett, you see they must. Mrs. Hartwell has legal standing, blood relation, and the financial means to provide these children with advantages you, he gestured at the ranch with barely concealed contempt, could never offer. Surely even you can see that a remote cattle ranch is no place for young girls of good breeding. They're happy here, Sarah said, stepping onto the porch. Her voice was steady, but Garrett could see the tremor in her hands. They're safe, cared for, and loved. Harrison's smile sharpened. Miss Reed, is it illegitimacy is such an unfortunate circumstance. He pulled papers from his case with theatrical precision. I have here documentation of Mrs. Hartwell's blood relation to the children. Character references from Boston's finest society members. Letters from institutions willing to testify to your unsuitable living arrangements. He paused for effect. I also have evidence of fraud. You've been representing yourself as these children's mother, when in fact you have no legal connection to them whatsoever. That Miss Reed is kidnapping. That's a damn lie, Garrett growled. Can you produce adoption papers, legal guardianship documents, any formal recognition of Miss Reed's authority? Harrison's eyebrows rose in mock inquiry. No, which means every day she's kept them is another day of criminal activity. Get off my land, Garrett said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. I'll leave, cousin, but I'll be back with the sheriff in a court order. Harrison tipped his hat to Sarah with exaggerated courtesy. Mrs. Hartwell is willing to forget this unpleasantness if you surrender the children voluntarily. He climbed into his buggy, but before driving off, he turned back. Oh, and Garrett, you might want to have your property documents reviewed. I've been going through county records, and there seem to be some interesting irregularities regarding your water rights and mineral claims. Father's estate was never properly settled. As his nephew, I have certain legal interests that may need to be addressed. Then he was gone, leaving a trail of dust and implied threats in his wake. Sarah swayed slightly, and Garrett caught her elbow to steady her. He can't actually charge me with kidnapping, can he? He can try. Whether it would stick is another matter. Garrett's mind was racing. Harrison's interest in his land wasn't coincidental. His cousin had been sniffing around the ranch's borders for years, but this timing connecting it to the custody battle that was strategic. He's going to use this against us, Sarah said, her voice hollow. He'll make me look like a criminal, and the court will have no choice but to give the girls to Catherine. Not if we move first. Garrett turned to her, an idea forming with reckless speed. We need to change the situation, make it harder for them to separate you from the girls. How? We need to make you family, legally. He paused, letting the words settle between them. We need to get married. Sarah stared at him like he'd lost his mind. What? Think about it. As my wife, you'd have legal standing. The girls would be under my protection as your husband. Harrison can't claim you're unfit if you're a married woman with a stable home. And Catherine's blood relation claim gets weaker when you're part of an established family unit. Garrett, that's insane. You can't marry someone just to win a legal battle. Why not people get married for worse reasons? At least this would be for something that matters. He could see her wavering, see the desperate hope fighting with practical resistance. It doesn't have to be real, Sarah. Not in the ways that matter to you. We can keep separate rooms, maintain whatever distance you need. But on paper, to the law, you'd be Mrs. Blake. And those girls would be as good as mine. You don't know what you're offering, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Marriage is permanent, Garrett. Who says I'm throwing it away? The words came out rougher than he'd intended, carrying weight he hadn't meant to reveal. You've been here nearly 3 weeks. In that time, this house has felt more like home than it has in a decade. Those girls have brought life back to a place that was slowly dying, and you... He stopped, struggling with articulation. You work harder than anyone I have ever known. You don't complain. Don't expect more than you have earned. You're raising 2 children who aren't yours by blood because you promised someone you loved that you'd protect them. What exactly about that makes you unsuitable for marriage? Sarah's eyes had filled with tears. I'm illegitimate, Garrett. If you do this, you'll be tying yourself to someone with a shameful past. I don't give a damn about society's standards, never have a own. He moved closer. Here's what I know. Those girls need you. You need protection from people like Catherine Hartwell and my snake of a cousin. And I need... He paused, surprised by the truth of what he was about to say. I need to know that when I come back from the far pastures, there will be voices and someone who cares whether I made it home safe. That's not love, Sarah whispered. Maybe, but it's honest, and it's more than most people start with. He took her hand. I'm not offering you romance, Sarah, but I can offer you partnership, respect, protection, a legal standing that Catherine Hartwell can't easily break, and a home for those girls that nobody can take away. From inside the house, Emma's voice called out, Sarah, is everything all right? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, Garrett saw the moment she made her decision. All right, she said quietly. If you're sure, if you really mean this, then yes, I'll marry you. The word should have felt momentous. Instead, it settled over Garrett with the simple rightness of a decision long overdue. We'll do it tomorrow. I'll ride to town first thing, get the license, find a judge willing to perform the ceremony. Can you be ready by afternoon? Sarah laughed a slightly hysterical sound. Ready, Garrett. I own 2 dresses and a pair of boots. I'm about as ready as I'll ever be. That's all you need. He squeezed her hand once, then released it. Go tell the girls. They should hear it from you first. Sarah nodded and turned toward the house, but at the door she paused. Garrett, thank you for fighting for us. I know it's just a strategy, but thank you. She disappeared inside before he could tell her that somewhere along the way it had stopped being just a strategy. That the thought of Catherine Hartwell taking those girls of Sarah, disappearing from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it, had become physically painful. And he was tired of being hungry. The wedding took place the next afternoon, Tuesday, in Judge Morrison's chambers at precisely 2 o'clock. Sarah wore her best dress, the gray wool she'd arrived in, cleaned and pressed. Lily had woven wildflowers into her braid that morning, yellow and purple blooms that softened the severity of her appearance. Garrett had worn his cleanest shirt and the jacket he kept for funerals and bank meetings. Sheriff Bridger stood it as witness along with Jed from the ranch. Both men wore expressions that suggested they understood exactly what this hasty marriage really was. A legal maneuver, a defensive strategy, a last desperate play before the enemy closed in. Judge Morrison was a practical man who'd seen enough frontier marriages to know that love was a luxury most couldn't afford. He kept the ceremony mercifully brief. Do you, Garrett Blake, take this woman? I do. Do you, Sarah Reed, take this man? I do. When the judge pronounced them married and suggested Garrett might kiss his bride, there was a moment of awkward hesitation. Then Garrett leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Sarah's forehead, brief and almost brotherly, before stepping back. Sarah's eyes had closed at the contact, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Well then, Judge Morrison said, signing the certificate. Mrs. Blake, you and your husband have my congratulations, and my prayers considering the storm that's headed your way. They left the courthouse as husband and wife, the certificate folded carefully in Garrett's pocket, like ammunition for the battle ahead. The next days passed in a blur of preparation and mounting dread. Sarah wrote her statement, then rewrote it twice at Garrett's insistence until every detail was clear. Garrett sent telegrams to San Antonio tracking down anyone who'd known the Hartwell family. The responses that trickled back were encouraging. A neighbor who remembered Sarah's devoted care. A shopkeeper who testified to her integrity. Even the pastor who'd presided at Margaret's funeral, noting that she'd specifically named Sarah as guardian. But Catherine wasn't idle either. More legal documents arrived. Prepared custody petition, financial statements, depositions from Boston Society members, all painting Sarah as unfit. On the 4th evening after the wedding, Lily developed a fever. It started with a cough at dinner, then progressed to flushed cheeks and glassy eyes. By the time Sarah put her to bed, the child was burning up, shivering despite the quilts. Sarah's immediate panic was visceral. Not Lily, Emma whispered from the doorway, her face white with terror. Please not Lily, too. Garrett found Sarah at midnight, still sitting beside Lily's bed, running cool water over the girl's forehead, with shaking hands. Her own face was pale, her eyes wild. I can't lose her, Sarah said when she saw him. I can't. I promised I'd keep them safe. She's not going to die. Garrett crossed to the bed, placed his hand on Lily's forehead. Hot, yes, but not the deadly burning heat. This isn't the same sickness. You don't know that. I'm riding for the doctor. Now. He turned to leave, but Sarah caught his arm. It's midnight. It's 10 miles. I know my land in the dark. Stay with her. Keep her cool. I'll be back before dawn. He was. Dr. Fletcher roused from sleep and promised double his usual fee confirmed it. Not the deadly fever, just a common childhood illness that would pass with rest and care. But Garrett stayed up with Sarah anyway through the long hours of the night. And at 3 in the morning, when the fever finally broke and Lily fell into peaceful sleep, Sarah collapsed in the chair beside the bed, exhausted. Garrett knelt beside her, took her cold, trembling hands in his. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. No matter what happens in that courtroom, I'm not letting them take her. Or Emma. Or you. Sarah looked at him through tears and something shifted in her expression. Something that looked dangerously like hope mixed with something warmer. Thank you, she whispered. For this, for all of it. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that somewhere in the past 3 weeks she'd stopped being a stranger. But the words wouldn't come, so he just held her hands and stayed. 2 days later, they received word from Margaret Chen, the lawyer Sheriff Bridger had recommended from Austin. She arrived that afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a leather case full of documents and a reputation for taking cases others considered unwinnable. She spent 6 hours reviewing everything, interviewing Sarah, questioning Garrett, examining the marriage certificate, reading the statements from San Antonio, and finally she delivered her assessment with brutal honesty. You have a case, she said, sitting at Garrett's kitchen table with papers spread before her. Not a strong one, but a case. The marriage helps significantly. It establishes Sarah as a respectable married woman. Garrett's standing in the community helps. The testimony about Catherine's absence and Sarah's devoted care helps. She paused significantly. But Catherine has blood relation, financial resources, social standing. In custody disputes, blood still matters a great deal to most judges. So what do we do? Sarah asked, her hands twisted together. We tell your story, all of it. We make the judge see that you're not some opportunistic stranger who stole children. You're their sister, their mother in everything but legal documentation, the person their own mother chose to protect them. We humanize this, make it about the girl's well-being. And the property dispute, Garrett asked. Harrison's claims are largely groundless. Your father's will is clear enough, and your brother signed quit-claim deeds years ago. But he's found some ambiguities in the water rights documentation. Nothing that would actually hold up in court, but enough to cause delays. My guess is he's using it as pressure. That's not happening, Garrett said flatly, which means we fight both battles. Margaret Chen gathered her papers. The hearing is in 4 days. I'll prepare opening statements. In the meantime, I need you both to write out complete timelines of your relationship with these children. Every detail, every moment that shows the depth of your connection. And I need character witnesses. The final days before the hearing passed in organized chaos. Sheriff Bridger came by with additional statements. Jed and the other ranch hands wrote testimonials. The pastor from town agreed to testify. Through it all, Sarah moved with mechanical precision, doing what needed to be done, while some essential part of her seemed to have gone numb. She cooked, she cleaned, she cared for the girls. She wrote her timeline in careful script that grew less steady as she reached the parts about Margaret's death. At night, Garrett could hear her crying through the thin wall that separated their rooms. Quiet, contained sobs that she tried to muffle so the girls wouldn't hear. He wanted to go to her to offer comfort or at least companionship. But he'd promised her space, and barging into her room in the middle of the night didn't feel like honoring that promise. So he lay awake on his side of the wall, listening to her grief, and felt helpless in a way that work and determination couldn't fix. On the night before the hearing, Garrett found Sarah sitting on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. She'd wrapped herself in a shawl against the cooling air, and her eyes were fixed on the stars. Can't sleep, he asked, settling onto the step beside her. Don't want to. Feels like if I stay awake, I can keep tomorrow from coming. Doesn't work that way, unfortunately. I know. Sarah pulled the shawl tighter. I keep thinking about what Margaret Chen said, that we have to humanize this. But what if that's not enough? What if the judge looks at me and just sees what Catherine wants him to see? Is that what you think you are? It's what I've been told I am my entire life. Garrett was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. When I came back from the war, I was broken. Lost friends. Lost my faith in pretty much everything. I came back here and threw myself into the ranch because it was something I could control. He paused, staring out at the dark shapes of his cattle. But you know what I learned? You can't live your whole life avoiding risk just because you've been hurt before. You can't let the worst parts of your past define who you are forever. At some point, you have to decide you're worth more than what other people said about you. Sarah turned to look at him, her face half shadowed in the moonlight. Is that what you've done? I'm working on it. Having you three here that's helped. Made me remember that isolation isn't the same thing as safety, that sometimes the risk is worth it, even when the risk is losing everything. Especially then. Garrett met her eyes. Tomorrow we go into that courtroom and we tell the truth. We show that judge what family really means. Not blood, not legal documents, but the choice to show up every day and love someone even when it's hard. That's what you've done for those girls, Sarah. That's what makes you their mother. And what does it make you? She asked softly. The question hung in the air between them. What was Garrett to these girls? Their protector, their provider, the man who'd married their guardian to keep them safe. But was that the same as being a father? I don't know yet, he said honestly. But I'd like the chance to find out. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers lacing through his with surprising firmness. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on, while the night deepened around them, and tomorrow loomed closer. Inside, they heard Lily cry out in her sleep, and Emma's voice low and soothing, comforting her sister. The sound of it, of these children caring for each other, strengthened something in Garrett's chest. Tomorrow they would fight. Tomorrow they would face judges and lawyers, and people who wanted to tear this fragile thing apart. But tonight they were together, tonight they were home, and that Garrett thought was worth fighting for with everything he had. Even if he couldn't quite bring himself to say it out loud yet. Dawn arrived too quickly. Garrett rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, his body moving through morning routines while his mind churned through every possible outcome. He found Sarah already in the kitchen, her hair pinned back with unusual severity, wearing her best dress. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee. The girls are still sleeping, she said without turning around. I thought I'd let them rest as long as possible. Margaret said we need to be at the courthouse by 9 o'clock. Garrett accepted the coffee, noting the dark circles under her eyes. We're going to get through this. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Sarah set down her own cup with more force than necessary, the china rattling. You don't know that, Garrett. You can't promise me that. What if the judge decides blood matters more than love? What if, her voice cracked, what if I lose them? What if this is our last morning together? Garrett moved around the table and did something he had been wanting to do for days. He pulled her into his arms, feeling her stiffen with surprise before gradually relaxing against his chest. She was smaller than she seemed when she was putting on that fierce front. Her head barely reached his shoulder. Then we'll appeal, he said quietly into her hair. And if we lose the appeal, we'll find another way. But I'm not giving up, Sarah. Not on those girls, and not on you, so you don't get to give up either. She was crying now, silent tears dampening his shirt. Garrett just held her, offering no empty platitudes, just the solid reality of his presence. Eventually, she pulled back, wiping at her eyes. I'm sorry, I shouldn't. This isn't your burden to carry. The hell it isn't. I married you, didn't I? That makes it my burden, too. He caught her hand, the one wearing his ring. We're in this together, Sarah. For better or worse, remember, and this, he gestured at the weight pressing down on both of them. This is definitely the worst part. But we're still standing, still fighting. A small, watery smile crossed her face. When did you become so good with words? I'm not. I'm just saying what's true. He released her hand reluctantly. Go wake the girls. Get them ready. I'll hitch the wagon. The courthouse sat in the center of town, an imposing brick structure that looked far too official for the rough frontier community it served. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. Curious townspeople, supporters who'd come to testify, and Catherine Hartwell herself, resplendent in black silk. She stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by Harrison and two other men in expensive suits, her lawyers presumably imported from Austin or Houston. Her eyes found Sarah as the wagon pulled up, and her expression shifted into something cold and triumphant. Mrs. Blake, Catherine called out, the title dripping with sarcasm. How lovely that you could make it. The children can leave with me directly once the judge makes the sensible decision. Emma's hand tightened on Sarah. Lily pressed her face into Garrett's side, trembling. Garrett felt something fierce and protective surge through him. "They're not going anywhere with you," he said quietly, but his voice carried. "Not now, not ever." "We'll see what Judge Morrison has to say about that," Harrison interjected smoothly. Margaret Chen appeared at that moment, her arms full of documents. "Mr. and Mrs. Blake, girls, let's get inside." The courtroom was smaller than Garrett had expected, with wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. Judge Morrison was already seated at the bench, a man in his 60s with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He watched them file in with carefully maintained neutrality. The next hour passed in a blur of legal procedure. Catherine's lawyers presented their case, first painting Sarah as an opportunistic imposter who'd stolen children, hidden them away, and manufactured a hasty marriage to avoid consequences. They produced birth certificates proving Catherine's blood relation, letters from Boston Society members, financial statements showing Catherine could provide advantages far beyond what a frontier rancher could offer. Through it all, Sarah sat rigid beside Garrett, her face pale but composed. Only the death grip she maintained on his hand revealed the terror beneath her calm exterior. Then it was Margaret Chen's turn. She stood and addressed the court with confidence. "Your Honor, this case isn't about blood relation or financial resources. It's about what's best for two little girls who've already lost more than children should have to lose. Their parents died within days of each other, leaving them with nothing. Mrs. Hartwell claims concern now. But where was she when they were grieving? Where was she when they had nowhere to sleep? Where was she during the 6 months Mrs. Blake sacrificed everything to keep them fed, clothed, and together?" Margaret moved to stand beside Sarah. "The answer is simple. She wasn't there. She didn't care until it became convenient. This isn't about family, Your Honor. It's about control." Catherine's lead lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. Mrs. Hartwell's motives are not—" "Overruled," Judge Morrison said mildly. "I'll hear the full argument. Continue, Miss Chen." Margaret nodded. "Mrs. Blake has cared for these children with devotion that goes beyond duty. She's their sister by blood, their father's daughter from a previous relationship. She's the person their mother chose as guardian on her deathbed, and she's the only mother these girls have known for the past 6 months. To tear them away now would be cruel and traumatic." She returned to the table and pulled out documents. "I have testimony from Sheriff Bridger, statements from Mr. Blake's ranch hands, letters from community members, and most importantly," Margaret looked directly at the judge, "I have the children themselves who can tell you exactly where they want to be." Judge Morrison leaned back. "I'd like to hear from the children, but separately, without either party present. Bailiff, please prepare my chambers." Garrett felt Sarah tense beside him. This was it. If Emma and Lily couldn't articulate their wishes clearly, it could all fall apart. "It'll be all right," he whispered to Sarah. "They're strong." But watching Emma and Lily disappear into the judge's chambers, their small hands clasped together, Garrett felt his certainty waver. The wait was excruciating. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 45. Catherine looked increasingly confident. Harrison kept glancing at Garrett with barely concealed satisfaction. Finally, the door opened. Judge Morrison emerged alone, his expression unreadable. He took his seat and surveyed the courtroom. "I've spoken with both children at length," he said. "They are articulate, intelligent, and remarkably clear about their feelings. Before I render my decision on the custody matter, however, I'd like to address the property dispute that seems to be entangled with this case." He turned his attention to Harrison. "Mr. Blake the Younger, you've filed claims suggesting irregularities in your cousin's title to certain water rights and mineral claims. I've reviewed the documentation you submitted. I've also reviewed the original land grants, your uncle's will, and the quitclaim deeds signed by Garrett Blake's brothers." Harrison's face had begun to redden. "Your claims are without merit," Judge Morrison continued. "The water rights are clearly assigned to the main ranch property. The mineral survey you cite as ambiguous is no such thing. Your attempt to contest these established property rights appears to be nothing more than harassment designed to create leverage in an unrelated custody dispute." His gaze was steel. "Your property claims are dismissed. If you file similar frivolous claims in the future, I'll hold you in contempt." Harrison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "As for you, Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Morrison said, "I have some questions." Catherine straightened her composure, faltering slightly. "Of course, Your Honor. When was the last time you saw these children before arriving in Texas? I visited once, approximately 5 years ago. And you maintained regular correspondence with their mother afterward, inquired about their well-being. Catherine's jaw tightened. My sister and I were not close. So the answer is no, you had no contact for 5 years. Yet when they became the orphans, suddenly you developed deep concern. Why is that? They are my blood, your honor. Family obligation. Family obligation is a curious thing, Judge Morrison interrupted. It seems to activate very selectively. Tell me, if I were to grant you custody, what are your plans for these girls? I would take them to Boston, enroll them in proper schools. She hesitated just for a moment. Together. Catherine's pause was fractional but damning. While their ages and temperaments differ significantly, it might be more suitable to place them in separate educational environments. Judge Morrison's voice went flat. So you'd separate them, these two little girls who've already lost their parents, who've been through upheaval and uncertainty, who clearly depend on each other. You'd tear them apart for the sake of suitable education. It would be in their best interest long term. Would it, or would it simply be more convenient for you? Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Hartwell, I've been a judge for 23 years. I've seen a lot of custody disputes. And I've learned that blood relation doesn't automatically confer wisdom or love. Sometimes the people who fight hardest for custody are the ones who should never have it. He paused, letting his words settle over the courtroom. I spoke with Emma and Lily Hartwell this morning. Emma is 7 years old, but she has the gravity of someone much older. Lily is 5, still young enough to believe in safety, but old enough to know when it's threatened. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Sarah's hand in Garrett's was trembling. And you know what they told me? Judge Morrison's voice softened slightly, but lost none of its authority. They told me that Sarah is their mother. Not the woman who gave birth to them, they remember her fondly, but the person who mothers them now, who sits up with them through nightmares, who teaches them their letters, who makes sure they feel wanted and safe. His voice maintained its gravity. They told me that Garrett is teaching them about horses and ranching and how to be strong when things are hard. They told me their house has a garden with vegetables they help plant, chickens they help feed, a porch where they sit together in the evenings and watch the stars. Judge Morrison continued. They also told me they don't know you, Mrs. Hartwell, that the one time you visited, you said Emma was too headstrong and Lily was too delicate, that you made their mother cry, and that they're terrified you'll separate them and send them away from the only home they have left. Catherine had gone pale. Her lawyer was whispering urgently in her ear, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. The law gives weight to blood relation in custody matters, but it also, and more importantly, gives weight to the best interests of the child. And in this case, those interests are clear. These girls are thriving under Mrs. Blake's care. They're healthy, educated, loved, stable. They have a community that supports them, a home that welcomes them, and guardians who married specifically to protect them from being torn apart by relatives who couldn't be bothered to care when it actually mattered. He picked up his gavel. Garrett felt Sarah stop breathing beside him. Therefore, I hereby deny Mrs. Hartwell's petition for custody. Legal guardianship of Emma and Lily Hartwell is granted to Sarah Blake with full parental rights and responsibilities. Mrs. Hartwell, you are welcome to apply for visitation rights through proper channels. But I warn you, if you attempt to harass this family further or interfere with these children's stability, I will hold you in contempt and issue a restraining order. Am I clear? The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the courtroom like thunder. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Sarah made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and turned to bury her face against Garrett's shoulder. His arms came around her, automatically holding her, while she shook with relief and joy and residual terror, all crashing together. We won, she whispered against his shirt. Oh God, Garrett, we won. I told you we would, he murmured back, though his own voice was rough with unexpected emotion. Margaret Chen was grinning. Sheriff Bridger had appeared from the back of the courtroom, his weathered face creased with approval. Catherine swept past them toward the exit, her lawyers trailing behind, her face twisted with fury. Harrison followed, pausing just long enough to shoot Garrett a look of pure venom. This isn't over, he hissed. "Oh, yes, it is," Sheriff Bridger said pleasantly, materializing at Harrison's elbow. "And I'd suggest you leave town before I remember all the other charges I could file against you." Harrison left without another word, and Garrett felt the last thread of tension in his shoulders finally release. It was over, really, truly over. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and Emma and Lily came running out, their faces bright with hope and uncertainty. "Sarah," Emma's voice was small, scared to hope. "What happened?" Sarah dropped to her knees, opening her arms. Both girls crashed into her, and she held them tight, tears streaming down her face. "We're staying together," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of us. You're mine, and nobody can take you away. Nobody." Lily started crying in earnest, happy tears that soaked into Sarah's shoulder. Emma held on with fierce intensity. And Garrett stood watching them, this fragile family he'd somehow become part of, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was what home felt like. Not the land or the house or the cattle, but these three people who'd stormed into his isolated life and refused to let him hide anymore. Judge Morrison approached them. "Mrs. Blake," he said to Sarah, who was still holding the girls, "those are exceptional children you have. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt your right to them." "I won't, Your Honor." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank yourself for fighting when most people would have given up." He turned to Garrett. "And you, Mr. Blake, you've taken on quite a responsibility." Garrett shook his hand firmly. "Best decision I ever made." And as he said it, he realized it was true. The ride back to the ranch was jubilant, despite everyone's exhaustion. Lily chattered nonstop about how the judge had asked her about her doll and whether she liked feeding chickens. Emma was quieter, but kept stealing glances at Garrett and Sarah with something that looked like cautious wonder. By the time they pulled into the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. The ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, and Jed took one look at their faces before letting out a whoop. "We won!" Lily shouted back, her voice high and clear with joy. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey saved for special occasions. The hands took turns congratulating Sarah and shaking Garrett's hand. Even Sam admitted that the ranch felt better with children around, though he'd deny it if anyone repeated that sentiment. As evening settled over the land, Garrett found himself on the porch again, watching the prairie fade into twilight. Sarah joined him after getting the girls settled for bed, moving to stand beside him at the railing. They were silent for a long moment, just existing together in the quiet aftermath of the storm they'd weathered. Sarah broke the silence first. "I keep expecting to wake up. Keep expecting this to be a dream." "It's real," Garrett said. "You're allowed to believe that now." "I don't know if I know how. I've spent so long waiting for the next disaster." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last of the sunset. "You saved us, Garrett. We would have lost without you. You would have found another way. You're too stubborn to give up." "Maybe, but I wouldn't have had this." She gestured at the ranch, the house, the land stretching endlessly. "I wouldn't have had a real home to fight for. And I wouldn't have had—" She stopped, struggling with words. "Wouldn't have had what?" Garrett prompted gently. Sarah's voice went soft, vulnerable. "A partner. Someone who stood beside me instead of just feeling sorry for me. You could have just offered us shelter, Garrett. You could have let us stay as employees, kept your distance. But instead you married me. You put everything on the line. Your land, your reputation, your carefully built life. For three strangers who had no claim on you whatsoever. You're not strangers anymore." "No, we're not." She moved closer, and Garrett felt his breath catch as she placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat beneath her palm. "We're family. Really, truly family. And I know we got married for legal reasons. I know you said it didn't have to be real. But Garrett," she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something else. Something that made his chest tighten with hope. "It feels real to me. Has for a while now. And if you don't feel the same way, that's fine. I can keep it to myself, but I—" Garrett cut off her rambling by doing what he'd wanted to do since the moment she'd stood in his kitchen, with defiant tears on her face, defending those girls with every ounce of strength she possessed. He cupped her face in his rough, scarred hands and kissed her. Not the chaste, brotherly kiss from their wedding ceremony. This was real, deep, full of all the things he'd been too scared or too stubborn to put into words. When he finally pulled back, Sarah was staring at him with wide eyes and parted lips. "It's real to me, too," he said quietly. "Has been since somewhere around the second week. Maybe earlier. I kept telling myself it was just strategy, just protection, just doing the right thing. But the truth is, Sarah, I haven't felt this alive in years. Haven't wanted to come home to anyone the way I want to come home to you. You and those girls, you've made this house feel like home again. Made me remember why I built this place to begin with." "Why did you build it?" Sarah whispered. "For family. My parents raised 4 kids here. Filled these rooms with noise and laughter and all the messy chaos of people who love each other. After the war, after I came back broken, I thought I wanted silence. But what I really wanted was for it to feel like home again. I just didn't know how to make that happen alone." Sarah's tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "So what do we do now? Now that the fighting's over and we won," Garrett thought about it, about the work that would need doing tomorrow and every day after. Fences to mend, cattle to tend, a garden that needed weeding, children who needed raising. He thought about the reality of marriage not as a legal strategy, but as a daily choice. "Now we live," he said simply. "We build something real and solid and permanent. We raise those girls together. We figure out what this marriage is supposed to look like when we're not in crisis mode. We make mistakes and fix them and keep going anyway." "That sounds complicated." "Probably will be, but I'm starting to think complicated is better than empty." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a declaration. "Stay with me, Sarah. Not because you have to, not because it's legally convenient, but because you want to. Build this life with me, for real." "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "I want that. I want all of it." From inside the house came the sound of Emma's voice calling out that Lily was asking for one more story before sleep. Sarah laughed and pulled away reluctantly. "Duty calls. Go, I'll be there in a minute." Garrett watched her disappear inside, heard her greeting the girls with warmth and affection, heard their excited voices, the sounds of family, of home, of a life he'd stopped believing he could have. He remained on the porch a little longer, looking out at the land he'd fought to keep, the ranch he'd built from nothing. It looked different now somehow. Not just property to be defended, but a foundation for something larger than himself. A place where broken things could be mended, where lost people could find belonging, where love could grow in the spaces between hard work and honest struggle. The stars were beginning to emerge, scattered across the darkening sky like promises. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was always more work to be done on a ranch, always something needing attention. But tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. Garrett headed inside to find Sarah sitting on Lily's bedbook, open in her lap. Both girls curled up beside her, listening with rapt attention. Emma looked up as he entered and silently shifted over, making room. He settled onto the bed's edge, and without missing a beat in her reading, Sarah reached out and took his hand. Lily's eyes were already drooping. Emma fought sleep with characteristic determination, but was losing the battle. Sarah's voice was soft and steady, weaving the story around them like a blanket. This was it, Garrett realized. This ordinary, perfect moment. After all the fighting and fear and uncertainty, they'd arrived at something achingly simple. A family sitting together at the end of a long day. Just being. When the story ended and both girls had finally surrendered to sleep, Garrett and Sarah tucked them in with practiced coordination, moving around each other with the ease of long partnership. They stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the girls, Emma with one arm flung over her head, Lily curled around her doll, both of them safe and settled and home. "Our girls," Sarah whispered. "Our girls," Garrett agreed, and the word felt right in his mouth. Felt true in a way that legal documents and judges' rulings never could be. They retreated to the main room, and for the first time since they'd married, Sarah didn't go to her separate bedroom. Instead, she took Garrett's hand and led him to the room they would share, the one that would become theirs through accumulated nights and shared mornings and all the intimate mundanities of marriage. At the threshold, she paused suddenly, shy despite everything that had been said between them. "Are you sure about all of this, about us?" Garrett pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I've never been more sure of anything. You're mine, Sarah Blake, and I'm yours. For real this time. No more pretending it's just strategy or convenience. No more pretending, she agreed and kissed him again, sealing the promise. Outside, the Texas night stretched endlessly in all directions, full of possibility and promise. The ranch settled into its evening rhythms, familiar and solid. And inside the house that had been silent for so long, four hearts beat in comfortable synchrony, building something that no judge's ruling or legal battle could ever truly define. They'd won more than the custody today. They'd won the right to be a family. Messy, complicated, unconventional, but undeniably real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The story came full circle, like all good stories do. The late afternoon sun of 1911 painted the same porch in the same golden light, but everything had changed. Garrett Blake, now 65 and silver-haired, finished his tale. His grandson Thomas stood beside him, no longer restless, but still absorbing the weight of what he'd heard. "So that's how it happened," Garrett said quietly. "That's how your grandmother came into my life. How Emma and Lily became my daughters in every way that mattered. How we built this." He gestured at the ranch spread before them. 30 years had transformed it. More buildings, more cattle, more prosperity, but the heart remained the same. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Were you scared when you married Grandma? When you decided to fight?" "Terrified," Garrett admitted. "I'd spent years after the war trying to avoid exactly that kind of risk, trying to control everything so I couldn't be hurt again. But you know what I learned?" He looked at Thomas directly. "The things worth having are always scary, because they matter. Your grandmother mattered. Those girls mattered. This family mattered. And sometimes you have to risk everything for what matters. Otherwise, you're not really living. You're just existing." "Is that what I should remember?" Thomas asked. "When I'm over there?" "What you should remember is this. Blood doesn't make family. Choice does. Showing up every day, fighting for what's right even when it costs you. Your grandmother taught me that, and now I'm teaching you." Garrett paused, letting his words sink in. "When you're scared, and you will be scared, remember you come from people who faced down lawyers and judges and society's judgment and won. Not because we were special, but because we chose to fight for what mattered." Thomas nodded slowly, the lesson settling into him like seeds in good soil. Sarah approached from the garden, still graceful despite the years. Her hair had gone silver, her face lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from decades of smiling. She had dirt on her hands from planting, and when she smiled at her grandson, her eyes still held that fierce, protective love. "Are you filling his head with stories again, old man?" she asked, but there was warmth in her voice. "Just making sure he knows where he comes from." Sarah sat beside them, taking Garrett's hand with the automatic comfort of 3 decades of partnership. The same gesture worn smooth by repetition. "You come from love, Thomas," she said. "That's all you need to know. Love that fought. Love that lasted. Love that built all this." As the sun began to set, the rest of the family gathered. Emma rode in from the far pasture, now 37, and running the ranch operations. Her husband followed, and their 3 children tumbled out of the barn. Lily arrived from town with her own family, her gentle patience as a teacher having shaped a generation of children. Her husband was the town doctor, the same Dr. Fletcher who'd ridden through the night all those years ago. The evening meal was loud, chaotic, filled with the voices of 3 generations. 20 people around that same oak table Garrett's father had built. Children arguing over who got the last roll. Adults catching up on the day's work. Laughter and stories in the comfortable rhythm of family that had grown from those desperate beginnings. After dinner, as the family dispersed to various evening activities, Garrett and Sarah found themselves back on the porch. The same spot where so much had been decided. Where promises had been made. Where a family had been forged from broken pieces. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Giving up your solitude, taking on responsibility for 3 strangers, fighting battles you didn't have to fight." Garrett looked at the ranch spread before them, at Emma coordinating the next day's work, at Lily's children playing in the yard where Emma and little Lily had once played, at Thomas standing tall and brave, ready to face his own battles. "Not for a single day," he said. "Best decision I ever made. Because it turned out home wasn't a place you defended. It was the people you chose to defend it with. And he'd chosen well." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as the stars began to emerge. The same stars they'd watched 30 years ago when everything hung in the balance. But now there was no uncertainty, no fear, just the comfortable weight of a life well lived and a promise kept. Inside the house, the sounds of family continued. Children being called to bed, dishes being washed, doors closing and opening. The house finally breathing the way it had been built to breathe. Garrett closed his eyes and smiled. This, this was what it had all been for. Not the land, not the cattle, not even the house, though it mattered. It was for this moment, and all the moments that had come before it, and all the moments that would come after. It was for the family they'd built from nothing, for the love that had fought and won and lasted, for the home that finally, after so many years, knew how to breathe.